Today you can go along with one pass and do the whole job.
The only thing what they wanted after the tractor come out was mechanics.
When they came about, I can remember thinking, well, it must make life a lot easier.
When farming changed over the past 70 or 80 years, it undid the ways and methods of centuries. Whatever the Industrial Revolution achieved in the towns and cities, the countryside, right until the 30s, was still an economy based on the horse. The First World War may have affected most aspects of British society, but if there's an episode which most characterises the revolution in the countryside, it's the disappearance of the working horse and the coming of the tractor, the iron horse. The pace of life and the very social structure on the country estate villages had long been determined by jobs to do with the horse, even through the advances made from the 19th century onwards, and they've been considerable. Stephen Mayle has studied the Garrett steam engines made in Suffolk.
It's easy to think of the 1920s as a period where the diesel tractor was taking over from the horse, but actually machinery had been involved with farming for about 80 years. From about the 1840s onwards, the steam engine had been quite a familiar sight throughout the countryside. From about the 1840s onwards, the steam engine was very much involved with steam threshing, the threshing of corn that is, with ploughing, but of course in those days ploughing wasn't that much different from the ploughing that involved a horse. A steam engine pulled the plough from one side of a field to the other. It was a very slow business and not much different to the period of time it would have taken a horse to do the same job.
There was something almost alive about the traction engine. Its innards chomped and gurgled, and it slowly clanked along, black smoke puffing from its long chimney. And its oily-faced master squirted steam in all directions.
There are many similarities between the horse and the traction engine, because the steam engine was very much like the horse in the way that they were given names, and a horse that was fed with hay, so every morning and all day long, so was the steam engine fed. In its case, it was fed with water and with coal.
Horses were everywhere. Everything was horse-drawn. A lot of the farmers used to come in from the outlying villages. They came in on horseback, and that's how the people got about.
The farmers used to drive to market in what are called jingles, what you call governors' cars, and there'd be long strings of them coming in on market day, one after the other, and of course there were no tractors. Everything was done, all the farm work was done with horses.
When I was a child, the villages, practically everybody had an association with the land, either directly by working on it or working as a trade that was connected with farming.
The whole of the social organisation of the village and the farm was strictly hierarchical.
Hugh Barrett, farmer, writer and broadcaster, recorded 30 years ago.
There was the farmer himself, then the head horseman and the second horseman. These would be the most important people, with the head horseman absolutely at the top. And of course, underneath all these, the great ruck of labourers, the chaps whom no one asked anything of, except work.
The horse was the main thing. I mean, there wasn't a farm what hadn't got, say, 10 or a dozen horses. There'd be 3 or 4 pairs of horses always out at plough. I mean, that's the only way they ploughed the land. Most of the old men, you see, was all old ploughmen. That was their life.
Bill Eadie, now 80, would in the late 30s be one of the new generation of tractor drivers. His work routine would be nothing like the men who came before, like the late Joe Haddock, who was a horseman in Cambridgeshire.
I used to leave home 5 o'clock in the morning. You'd got to have 2 hours to feed your horses. That took 2 hours to fill a horse's stomach, because a horse won't eat anything was warmed up. So they was always fed just a little at a time, and as soon as they cleared one lot up, you give them some more.
Lorna Delanoy, who recorded and collected a set of reminiscences, including Joe's, still lives on the Fenland farm, where she recalls her father ploughing with horses.
After he'd had a jolly good breakfast, he would then go and get his horses and they would walk down the fen. And there was great pride in the turnout of your horses. You know, had they got glossy coats? Were their manes well braided? Were their brasses well shone? There was a great pride in the horseman's turnout. There was great pride in his work. I can remember Father on a Sunday evening, his interest would be to bike round as a young man and see whose land was beautifully ploughed and who'd got a crooked furrow, because then the one with the crooked furrow would be ridiculed the next time they met.
You'd want to plough an acre in the day, and you've got 30 rounds to go to do an acre in our fields. It was 15 chain long, and you'd be walking around there and walk about 10 miles.
Just how much all this achieved is put into sharp focus by 93-year-old Fred Wilson.
I walked out into the fields the other day and I saw a plough and it had 10 blades on the plough. And I thought to myself, my goodness, what a change in life. Because I still remember that same field being ploughed up with 2 horses on a plough. That would take the man over a week to plough that field. And this man who had this tractor was telling me that he'd have that all done in about 5 hours.
The ploughing these days is done sitting down in the dry, in a heated cab, with the radio on, with none of the harshness of the 20s and 30s, when ploughing would take its toll on wind and limb.
People who walked 7 and 8 miles a day in a ploughing day, it was a lot of pressure on their feet. My father suffered enormously with his old corns, as he would call them, brought on by badly fitting boots. And then when they got back to their small farms, they had to feed the animals, which again was a lot of pressure on their feet.
And you'd put these horses in the yard and give them a fleet of hay, and they'd be eating that till you went and had a drink and a bit of food.
After his 4 o'clock meal, he would then perhaps have a 10-minute nap if he had the time, but usually it was a question of eating the meal, going straight out to feed the pigs and rack up the horses. The expression racking them up was giving them hay for the night, making sure that they'd been groomed down, that any mud that was on their sleek coats was combed off, and he would get in by about 7 o'clock and very often fall asleep because he was just so physically tired. You know, he worked so hard and sadly didn't live to see his retirement.
The tractor made the working man's day a lot shorter, really, because you had to put petrol in a tractor, or diesel, or paraffin, or tractor vaporising fuel, I think was the official title of it. But because you could do that as soon as you got there, whereas a horse had got to be fed before he went out. He got to be fed at lunchtime as well, and again in the evening when he got home.
David Woodward, who worked on a farm in the 40s. The trouble with horses is, unlike tractors, they needed so much caring for even when they weren't working.
A horse could only work for, 2 or 3 hours, and then it stopped and had to have a bait, had to have food and a rest, and then off it went again.
Farmer and writer Robert Simper.
A tractor, once you started it in the morning, so long as you could hang on and keep going forward, it would keep going all day. And it was a lot quicker for just going backwards and forward to the fields. It could do that job. If you're going to a field that was half a mile away or a quarter of a mile away, you could get there a lot quicker in a tractor, so you got more done in a day. And then at the end of the day, you drove it into the shed, you switched it off, and then you got off and you walked away, and it required no further attention until Monday morning.
A farm tractor was originally a piece of equipment with a wheel at each corner, an engine and a gearbox, and it did the same sort of job as a horse. It pulled a piece of equipment through the soil or on top of the surface, and when you'd finished with the tractor you put it away for the night and you didn't have to feed it on Sundays.
Brian Bell. The final victory of the tractor wouldn't happen for decades, and its initial impact was minimal.
The first tractors appeared at the beginning of the 20th century, but they weren't really a serious threat to the horse until the 1920s, really.
In the early years of the century, some of the small pioneering firms which had led the way bringing steam power to our farms realised that their livelihood was under threat from the new tractors. One of these firms was Garrett's of Leiston in Suffolk. Stephen Mail.
Garrett's first began to become involved in production of diesel tractors in 1913 when Stephen Garrett developed the Agrimotor. Sadly, Stephen died in the First World War, and the idea of Garrett's involvement in diesel production was shelved until the late 1920s.
The mass production techniques that were being introduced to make cars were soon to be employed on tractors, and it was the Fordson that set the pace. Bill Eadie.
Old Henry Ford was really the start of all this. They invented the old Fordson tractor that grew on from there.
It was no more than something to sit on rather than walking behind a horse. It had an iron seat, 4 iron wheels, a paraffin engine that shunted along all day, and you were completely exposed to all weathers. In fact, a corn sack was very often put over the shoulders to keep the worst of the weather off, and you'd have another one on the iron seat to try and keep your bottom a bit warm. And from that point, they grew in importance.
The tractors that we had all had iron seats. That was a good beginning. And iron steering wheels. And on heavy land, if you were cultivating after ploughing and the land was hard, it was like riding a rough sea. You were bouncing about from one side to another, and the imprint of the seat was left on your arse for days.
They was cumbersome old things. They wasn't a tractor like we know today. And you'd go there the morning, and they started up on petrol. I mean, you had to get on and out, swing and handle, and you could swing, and you got a hot start because that warmed you up. And you turned them on to paraffin because paraffin was cheap. That was how the old tractor started. I mean, the tractor today, they just get in there, turn a starter, and there's a buzzing, and away they're gone. The old tractor too, as I knew it when I started driving, they'd got a very bad type of clutch. You had to be very careful when you got to the headlands and the ditch. You could be in that ditch because half the time our clutches didn't work.
It was round about 20-25 horsepower, had steel wheels, very simple gearbox. The driver was out in the weather. He had a belt pulley to drive some pieces of equipment, a drawbar at the back. He hitched onto his plough and off he went all day long, ploughing perhaps an acre, an hour if he was lucky.
On the Suffolk coast, Garrett's were making a last desperate bid to compete with the new iron horses. But the age of steam on the farm was drawing to a close. Stephen Mail.
When Fords started pushing tractors into this country from the First World War onwards, this had a profound effect on production of steam engines. It had a profound effect on companies like Garrett's. From the 1920s onwards, they had to look for new products. They moved into other areas. In Garrett's case, it was into electric vehicles. And it really brought about the end of the steam era. And it meant that companies like Garrett's had to diversify, and they did actually become involved with the production of diesel tractors. But of course, this was the late 20s. They'd missed the boat in many ways. And although these tractors were very successful in the various trials, they were twice the price of any other tractor, and so therefore unable to sell them.
The great lumbering traction engine was put out, if not exactly to grass, eventually to the museums and heritage rallies of today. But the tractor didn't just ride in like some Western gunslinger to send the horse and all to do with it packing. Far from it. Farms still relied on real horsepower. Horses and tractors worked side by side. Augie Paravani farmed in South Norfolk.
I always think that the best turnout we ever had is when we had a tractor to do the ploughing and heavy work and drilling and all the light work done by horses. But then as the old machines wore out, when they were replaced with a tractor machine, and gradually machines took over.
The tractor began to have an impact on the trades associated with farming. At first, having a tractor made little difference to the farm implements you used. the ploughs, the harrows or the binders. They were still the old horse-drawn tools, which were towed along by a tractor instead of horses. Miles Cutting, whose father farmed through the lean years of the 30s, remembers that the old tools were adapted for towing.
You can't just take an implement and turn round and hook it up to a tractor. So like a binder, you'd have to get either the local carpenter or blacksmith to make up brackets and drill the wood and everything so you could couple it up to the tractor.
I eventually started making these things to go behind the tractor.
But as farmers acquired tractors, it was more than the machinery that was to change. There was a challenge to the social structure on the farm, which had hitherto been led by the head horseman. It wasn't the older senior figures who were to become the tractor drivers. Brian Bell.
In the horse days, the head horseman and the head cowman and the farm foreman were very much the important people on the farm, and the tractor did away with the social hierarchy on the farms, and each man had his own tractor and tended to look after it, jealously guarded it in some cases.
In the late 30s, my grandfather bought a small Fordson tractor, the sort with the wide mudguard. And father, who was then in his mid-years, I suppose he'd be about 40 at the time, said no way was he going to touch that newfangled thing. It'd have to be the younger brother who would have to drive it. And so my Uncle George started tractor driving and using the tractor on the farm before the Second World War.
It was always the young men. I've never heard of one of the older men, and when I'm talking that I mean really over 40, who would have taken on the tractor. When it first came on the farm, usually the young blokes, chaps of about 20, they would jump on and say, well, I'll have a go, governor, you know, I'll have a go at that. And it would usually give it to the young man. And then the old men, quite quickly, of course, they found their status on the farm had been demoted, whereby as the head horsemen they were very important people and the governor would consult them over all how to work the fields and do things like that. They suddenly found themselves sidelined, and they were, I should think the word is resentful, really.
When the tractor come along, the tractor driver was beginning to get the head man on the farm. He was doing all the work then that the old horseman done. And the old horseman more or less had to take the boy's place, and he had to follow you.
I think people of my uncle's generation, I mean, he would be in his late 80s now, were he alive, people of that generation had to make a very quick adjustment, because dealing with live horses is a very different ballgame from dealing with a tractor, a combustion engine, about which they knew nothing. And my uncle, for example, who was the tractor driver of the farming family, he was regarded with almost esteem, the fact that he could conquer the internal combustion engine, and older people were still left with the horses. And there was a sadness too with these old horse keepers, the fact that you can't have a relationship with a machine, but with a horse, each horse had its own temperament, and if a horse was lame or ill, it needed attention, and there was a personal relationship with man and horse.
Boxer and Bowler and Smiler and Sprite and Captain and Club, all the horses were on the farms, you see. When your time come to take them off, if you went to turn them round at 3:30, they'd neigh. They knew it was their time to leave off, and they wouldn't turn.
I was born an animal man, and you got so used to saying, gee up, whoa. And this went on, even with a tractor. If you're doing a job with a tractor and you'd got something behind, the old boy behind it always shout, whoa! It's true.
In the villages which were at the heart of the rural communities, there were to be profound changes. Before the age of the tractor, the horse was the cornerstone of the local economy. The lives and livelihoods of the village people reflected that, and it was quite clear that this is how it had been for centuries. Lorna Delanoy.
It was a very different world before the Second World War. The trades of the village reflected the power of the horse.
The village was very much part of the farming scene, with the blacksmith and the saddle maker and lots of different shops and small suppliers close by.
Well, it was packed with tradesmen, you know, and they were tradesmen. I mean, they'd all had to serve perhaps 5-7 years apprenticeship.
The farmer relied on the blacksmith to shoe his horses, and to even make implements to use with his horse.
2 horses for every 50 acres. Well, that's a lot of horses about, you know. So they must have provided a tremendous lot of work. And of course, horse harrows and other gear, drag rakes and that, well, they would all, when they wanted repair, and they didn't go and buy another one, they could take them down to the blacksmith and get them repaired. It was a lovely Saturday morning job, take a horse to the blacksmith to be shod. You used to ride them, sort of sit astride them, bareback, and ride a horse down to the blacksmith and then stay with it while the blacksmith shod it. And that was always a lovely feeling when you came away. He'd want leg up, boy, and he'd leg you up on the horse, and you'd go up the hill and the sparks would be flying from these new shoes.
Frosty weather, they all brought the horses into the blacksmith to be frost nailed. They used to pull the nails out of the horses' hooves and put in nails with steel spikes on the end so they didn't slip on the road. I've seen horses queued up waiting to be frost nailed, nearly 100 yards long, the horses from the blacksmith shop waiting for their turn to be attended to.
Fred Wilson from Lavenham, the Suffolk village where I was born. In the 30s it was a place of just over 1,000 people, and there were 2 blacksmiths and several wheelwrights. At one, just round the corner from Huffy's the blacksmiths, the wheels would be made and rolled down the hill to where the steel tyres would be heated and shrunk on.
We made mangers and tumbles and wagons and traps, all that stuff, what was pulled by horses.
There'd be saddlers, horse doctors and farriers, and hay stores, and any yards off the main street would have stables which employed ostlers. The range of village shops spoke of a place which was self-sufficient. Few people had cars, but there was little reason to go out of the village. Everything you needed was there. Then, as the tractor took over, the unthinkable happened. The horse-based trades began to disappear. The first to go in many places was the harness maker and saddler. Len Aldous, who took over a Suffolk saddler's business in the 1920s, talking 30 years ago.
From the outset of taking the business, we decided that we got to have a different outlook. We got to try and move out into the countryside, try and get more trade. And of course, as the older saddlers, the little one-man saddlers died out in the villages, soon as ever they were gone, we went out and canvassed trade from their customers. The horses, of course, were gradually declining. I never thought that we should live to see horses really eradicated from the farms. 1 or 2 farmers in the early times, of course, had got the early type Fordson tractors. But there again, we thought, well, they can use them dry weather, use them after harvest. But we felt that most farmers, all farmers, would have to keep 1, 2 or 3 pairs of horses. They had to set the fields out. They had to finish them up. They had to cart all the sugar beet by horses. We thought, well, a tractor can never cart sugar beet. But today, you see, they take them out, they run the lorries on the field, they don't want horses. I never thought that we should live to see the horses really gone from the farms.
The more resourceful of the traders adapted to change. They developed their expertise with the coming of the tractor and mechanisation. Professor Alan Howkins of Sussex University warns us against seeing the change in the villages as completely unwelcome.
We have to be careful about making these things too romantic. If you look in the 1920s and 30s, you see blacksmiths becoming what? Motor engineers. Late 1930s, many of the directories that list trades in our towns and villages, you'll find a name like R. Smith, blacksmith, general furrier, motor engineer. The tractors created a whole new range of rural trades and perhaps brought marketable skills into the rural areas.
But even for young men like Augie Paravani, eager to seize the opportunities offered by the new technology, things didn't always go to plan.
When I first had a tractor in about 1933, I and my young brother, we got a summer till, 20 acres at night. A friend from the garage rigged up a light on this old tractor. We rigged up a tent with a couple of hurdles and the tractor sheet, and we did 3 hours apiece. And we ploughed this 20 acres 5 times during the summer, all at night. And I put it in wheat in the October, and I just about got my seed back. We'd forgotten the drainage. Ditches and hedges weren't done, drains weren't done, I just got like a bog. And that just about broke my heart.
Traditional relationships as fundamental as that between employer and worker were to undergo radical change. Until the Second World War, when the horse was still king and the new tractors had done nothing to improve the lot of rural people, life was hard for the farm worker and his family. There was real poverty, with little prospect of improvement. There was something futile about it. For the farm worker, it was an existence where an employer afforded him little dignity. Hugh Barrett.
There's no question that the farm workers were pretty harshly treated. They had been used to being treated like serfs. I don't think there's a better word for it, really. They didn't expect anything better. And to see them trudging up the drive to the farm in the morning was really sad. They were downtrodden in so many ways.
The humiliation for farm workers was compounded by the appallingly low wages they were paid.
Saturday midday, and why they chose that time I don't know, there was something like 50 men lined up outside the French windows of the dining room, waiting to be paid, one after the other. Albie, £2.19. You know, he'd be a thrashing chap, earning good money, but for the most of them it was 29 bob, 30 bob. You know, chaps with perhaps 3 or 4 kids, 5 kids.
This was the reality of Britain's last farming depression. It was a period when land prices plummeted and grain prices were at rock bottom.
This farm would have made considerably more in 1920 if it was sold. But in 1925 it was sold, and the drop in values was terrible. And then, of course, that was not the end of it. It still went on dropping. I've got 2 sons farming. Their wages were entered just the same as the other men that I had working for me, you see. But no money to pay them.
You could buy barley, Russian barley, landed on the banks of the Stour. You could buy that cheaper than the cost of thrashing your own. It was desperate.
In the late 20s and early 30s in the farming depression, small farmers found it very hard going to make a living. Poverty was acute, and Father always referred to it as the hungry 20s.
We could have gone to a farm sale almost every day of the week because farmers were going bankrupt right and left. I've been to sales where farm has been sold up, where perhaps that man has been farming all his life, and his father before him. And it was a terribly sad sight. I remember one particular farm where there was the usual dreadful collection of early lots, you know, heap of firewood, heap of iron, chaff cutter, heaps of wire, barrels of paint and this kind of thing. Real junk and rubbish, and the machinery, the implements were all falling to bits. But then came the horses, cart horses, which had been, I suppose, with the farmer a long time, and with which he and his men had worked, and on whom they depended really for their livelihood. These horses had been looked after well, and they did. They shone, and the horsemen had braided their tails and their manes up, and they looked marvellous. And I happened to catch a sight of the farmer's face, and the tears were just running down his cheeks. I think he could stand seeing the implements and the wagons and some of the household effects sold, but when it came to these animals, you know, these horses, you know, which was so much a part of his life, as much as his family was, and this was too much, and the tears were absolutely streaming down his face.
The tractor couldn't change such serious global economic problems, and the depression meant that the new technology was rarely affordable anyway. What we have here is a national economy in deep recession, with little in the way of subsidies or help from the government, low land values, and insufficient capital to invest in the machinery, which in any case was still pretty rudimentary. And this industry had the big, though poorly paid labour force, which was necessary for a horse-based economy. Remember, at this time there was no support from the welfare state. Those worst affected often saw only one tragic way out.
The number of farmers in the 30s who finished up with a shotgun wound in the head or threw themselves in the pond. I was farming in North Essex then, and the farm next to us had a drift which came almost past our front door. And one morning, there was a little boy belonging to this next farm. He can't have been above 11 years old. He came driving a big sow past the door, and we shouted out, "Hello, Billy." And he said, "Morning, Governor." And he looked quite pleased. He said, "Do you know what happened?" I said, "No, Billy, what's happened?" He said, "Father's hung himself." Good God. And he went on and turned back and he said, "He done it with binder twine." You know, there's something terrifying about the thought of someone hanging themselves with binder twine. Well, this just happened so often. You know, there was no way out. They were in the grip of an economic crisis that they'd got no understanding whatever. They were just broke.
Far from being a rural idyll, much of the countryside between the wars was a slum. The workers lived in poor, tumble-down cottages.
We were living in a tied house. That was a terrible thing when you had to get out and you'd got nowhere to go because the farmer could put you out, you know, onto the road.
It was a very poor village and the people were poor. The houses were in a very bad state. They were hovels, really. In the back streets of Lavenham, there was nothing but brick floors, and most of the men worked on farms, and nearly all these houses, they had corn sacks laying on the floor for carpets.
And the farms themselves were in a poor condition.
Well, there was no paint, I can tell you that. The house, no buildings. I mean, they were all in an awful state. They've been getting bad for a long time, but at the height of the Depression, it was just terrible. Barn roofs were coming off, never rethatched, holes everywhere. The only thing that was kept in order was the stables, and they had to be kept in good order, because without them, nothing could happen. I say we're completely horse-centred.
So the horse seems almost to have been more highly prized than the people who worked on the farm. Ironically, relief was on hand for the industry. It came, though, for the very worst of reasons. War.
Things were very desperate. I mean, the point is that Father packed up farming in 39. If he'd have hung on another year, the War Agricultural Committee was in, and farmers were getting grants for this and grants for that.
Ernest Bevin, the Minister of Labour in Churchill's wartime coalition government, made it quite clear that the rules had now changed. He wanted men and women to work on the land and for the farmers to feed the nation.
Whatever may have been the attitude of the country to agriculture in the past, we cannot forget our dependence upon you now. We won't. By the tremendous effort you make now, you will not only help to save the nation, but you will put it under an obligation never again to allow any of these basic industries on which the life and defense of the nation depends to go into decay. Now is the chance, then, to save the nation and win your own future.
Professor Sir Howard Newby, a leading thinker on rural change in the 20th century, reflected on the significance of what was happening at that time.
The Second World War ushered in, I think, what we can fairly call a second agricultural revolution, a revolution that was as extensive as the first one in the 18th century. And like the one in the 18th century, it was partly based on new technology. It began before the war, when tractors and the early combine harvesters were being brought in, but only very slowly and in very small numbers. Horse and hand technology on the farm still holds sway. And then we saw a massive reorganisation during the war. We had the introduction of the War Ags, the War Agricultural Executive Committees, which organised farming in their area. We saw the pooling of machinery, and we saw a wholesale technological revolution involving machinery, fertiliser and management on farms.
As a teenager, I started tractor driving just about as the war broke out, 1939. And I always remember the first out tractor I drove was an International 1020, an out American tractor. From then on, during the war, they got a lot of tractors on the land. And that's when I think the horse was really forgot about.
In a matter of months, the agenda for farming had changed. Money was now being invested in the form of subsidy, machinery and workers. The countryside was being cleaned up. The farms were to lead the way in digging for victory, and more land was brought under cultivation.
I remember going across Salisbury Plain. I was building up a pedigree herd in 1939. I drove across to Basingstoke to a farm sale, and acres and acres of land right across the Hampshire and the Wiltshire Plain were simply covered with docks and ragwort up to your waist. It was absolutely derelict. And yet, you see, within 2 or 3 years of the war, that was growing satisfactory crops of cereals.
There were thousands of acres drained, which hadn't been drained since maybe before the 20s even. So, one way and another, that work set up a lot of the land in a condition which would last for a very long time. In fact, nothing like it since has gone on, I think. It was a good foundation for long-term farming.
The changes on the land were acknowledged and celebrated by the wartime Minister of Agriculture, R.S. Hudson.
In 2.5 years, we've cut literally thousands of miles of hedges, cleaned out thousands of miles of ditches, drained in all some 3 million acres, and opened up old tracks to get the machinery to the field. England looks much more cared for today. We have to thank machinery and countries like Canada, Australia and the United States that have helped us with tractors and other implements.
I remember our first combine that was brought over from the States in boxes, and I put that together like a Meccano set. We had to make them before we could use them.
The War Ag allocated machinery, which of course was very difficult to get. I always thought that I was at the bottom of the pile. I never seemed to get anything until the first combine. And Lord, I wish I'd never seen it. It was an American Minneapolis Moline, damn thing. It was a yellow monster. It came in boxed form. We put it together without any notes on it, no instructions. I got it together all right and got it working, but it broke down. It was awful. The only thing it was good at was the actual thrashing. It was thrashed coconuts. It was immensely powerful.
Whereas before the war, many certainly of the smaller farmers couldn't afford a tractor, things were different now.
At the outbreak of war, there were less than 50,000 tractors in the whole of the British Isles, most of them in the big farms of eastern England. Although in 1936 we made in Britain 14,000 tractors, we exported more than half of them, so that the sales in Britain in the 1930s are probably less than 8,000 tractors a year. The thing that makes a huge difference is the Second World War. It was clear to government from the word go that if British agricultural productivity was to be significantly increased, one way, although it's not the only way, that this could be done was by mechanisation. And by the end of the war, there were over 200,000 tractors working on British farms. Now, there's lots of ifs and buts here, though. Not all those tractors, of course, were owned by farmers. Many of them were owned by the county war agricultural committees. That means they were owned by the government, and they were let out to farmers. But that still meant that farmers began to get a sense of the worth of tractors. The other thing to remember is that the horse didn't vanish overnight. In 1936, there were about 700,000 horses on British farms. In 1945, there were still 550,000 horses on British farms. That's a reduction of about 20%, but it still means that on many farms, if not most farms, and certainly the vast majority of small farms and farms in the non-heavily arable areas, the horse remained a central part of the motive power of farming in this country. And indeed it was to remain like that, really right through the 1940s and even into the early 50s.
There might still be plenty of horses at the end of the war, but the face of farming and certainly the thinking behind it had changed so much there'd be no return to the pre-war state of decay and near collapse.
In 1945, the kind of agriculture we had in this country was very, very different to the kind of agriculture we had in 1939. And then, because there was a determination not to go back, that was continued in 1947 with the Agriculture Act, which essentially continued the kind of wartime support for agriculture which we'd seen and carried that on over the next 40 years.
The other aspect of technological change was the use of fertilizers and sprays.
The cereal crops, the corn crops. I remember several years ago when 4 or 5 of us used to get in at the end of the field and weed them all by hand, 100 acres of corn. And we used to take a drill apiece with a little hoe we used to call a weeding iron, about 1.5 inches thick on the end of a stick, and prod our way up through the field, digging out the docks and the thistles and the chorlog. Today we can send a spray machine in and it kills 99% of the weeds.
The greatest effect that science had was to increase crop yields. There'd been little change in how much you harvested from a crop since the Bronze Age. More land over the centuries was brought under cultivation, but yields had remained the same. Then, in no time, yields doubled, and they're now 4 times what they were in the 20s. Robert Simper.
Certainly by the 50s, sprays and fertilizers were then in everyday use, and that made a tremendous difference, because once you could keep weeds out of the crop, it altered your yields dramatically. I mean, here in this part of the world, we had a weed called fat hen, which you can actually eat, but it turns into a small bush and it would swamp a crop. And even as late as 1980, I can remember sending 4 or 5 men with hand hoes walking through crops, pulling out fat hen. But once we got a spray, then overnight your yields shot up. You could more than double your yield just by getting rid of that one weed.
So a combination of the plant breeders, the farmers, the fertiliser, spray people and all the rest of it, which has made all the difference. Whereas if you got a ton an acre, you were doing extremely well. Nowadays, if you haven't got 3, you aren't doing anything.
Norfolk farmer, the late Augie Paravani. If the wartime farm tractor had arrived from America, the next entrant on the scene was a British invention. It was quite new in terms of both its small size and in what it could do for the farmer. It was the Little Grey Ferguson.
While most other manufacturers still copy the old horse-drawn principle, still building a machine to pull an implement, the Ferguson arrives. Not just a tractor, it represents a system, a brand new approach to mechanized farming.
Oh, that was a big stepping stone, because what made the Ferguson tractor was the hydraulic lift.
All right, what is the Ferguson system? It is no one thing. The Ferguson system is many things. For example, the system of linkage that makes the tractor and the implement one farming machine and gives the operator hydraulic control from the tractor seat. This in itself is revolutionary.
So the implement was carried on the tractor, and you could back into corners, you could manoeuvre very, very easily, whereas a trail plough, you couldn't really reverse it, and it was slow and cumbersome. But this Little Grey Fergie, as it was affectionately known, just revolutionised the whole farming industry, and the same mechanisms are still in use today.
That would do anything, and that was very light. It never got bogged down and that, as tractors do today. I mean, they're so big and heavy. They do all sorts of things to keep them on top. But the little old Ferguson was a tractor what they could use at anything, and that could do anything.
This was a tractor that didn't simply tow an implement. Anything that was hooked on behind almost became part of it, so that the tractor's engine was harnessed to work the plough, drill or whatever. The difference the Ferguson made to so many jobs was astonishing. Take muck spreading. In the old days, a very laborious task.
The manure used to be got out of these yards once a year with horses and tumbles and carted out onto the fields, pulled off the back of these carts with chrome forks, and they used to pull this manure out into heaps. There was about 5 to 6 heaps in a cartload, according to how big a load anyone put on and how bad a place it was to get out with your horse. Used to back your tumble in there and fill it with 4-tine forks. I've been doing that. We've been doing 35 loads a day. The 2 of us used to fill. One used to cart away and one used to lay it out on the field, so we'd got 3 carts going all the time.
When they brought out the old Ferguson trailer, which was hitched on and hydraulic, that took the place of the old horse and tumble.
So, with a Ferguson trailer, you could use hydraulic pressure simply to tip it up. Soon there'd be other attachments to load and spread it like a flail. The end of the working horse on farms was in sight, but the men on the land didn't appear to mind. There was none of the unrest that greeted the steam engine, or for that matter the early binder. Mars cutting.
Right in the early days, they even had strikes when the binder came on the scene, but everybody seemed to accept the tractor.
The men reacted really amazingly well, I think, to the advent of the Ferguson, because it was going to take a lot of work away, a lot of hard labour away. The Ferguson was very welcomed. In fact, there was a lot of competition as to who should drive it. I can only say that our horsemen did not want to. They wanted to stick to their horses.
But their time was going fast, and what some would regard as the romantic days were nearly over. Professor Alan Howkins.
We know that men loved their horses. They bought their own horse brasses, they decorated them, they looked after them in sickness often, and were hugely proud of them. Here, the tractor seems less an object of affection, perhaps. But having said that, that's changing. Now we collect tractors. We see endless old tractors.
Various changes that had started with the war would go on through the long period when we were recovering from war's ravages. There was an impetus that was government-led. Increased production was the goal. Robert Simper.
The Labour government just after the war knew that if it was going to stay in power, it had to feed people. There was still rationing, and so they threw money at agriculture like mad to try and force it on. They didn't want the price of food to rise to pay for this. They put in money, all sorts of grants and things to get to push agriculture on.
The real time that the tractor, or mechanisation in agriculture associated with the tractor in particular, really starts to go is in the 1950s. The reason for this is very, very clear. Firstly, you've got home-produced, cheap tractors, particularly the little grey Fergie. A small tractor, very, very efficient, very reliable, ideal for a small arable or mixed farm. Secondly, you've got long-term price stability in agriculture guaranteed by subsidies. This meant that farmers could look, really for the first time, at guaranteed income over a long period of time, which meant that they were able to invest in capital and in their land. And a major part of capital investment was always going to be mechanisation. Once the war had established the relative efficiency gains made by the use of tractors and other mechanised equipment, it really only took price stability and a decent product to make British agriculture almost entirely mechanised.
All sorts of changes were happening in British society. After the war, there'd been no return to pre-war agricultural serfdom, and the move to the towns and cities had begun.
There used to be 9 men work on this farm. Well, do you know they're doing the whole job today with 2 men.
The number of people working on farms has reduced over the years, mainly because, to start off with, we had a 25-30 horsepower tractor, and you probably needed 3 tractors and 3 men to do the work. We then moved up to a 70 horsepower tractor, where 1 tractor and 1 man could do the work of 3, so they really were no longer needed. So as men retired, they just weren't replaced.
The inference here is that the tractor drove out the workers. That isn't the case. It's not as simple as that.
Agricultural employment fell very dramatically in the interwar period. By the early 1930s, in Norfolk alone, it was estimated there were between 3,000 and 4,000 farm workers out of work. All that changed with the outbreak of war. Agriculture moved from a position of labour surplus to a position of labour shortage. In that, the tractor didn't replace human labour. There wasn't the human labour for it to replace. It assisted human labour, and it assisted human labour in increasing productivity. That again begins to change in the post-war period. From the early 50s, the numbers in agriculture begin to fall and fall quite dramatically, and most of that fall is among farm workers. What's clear is that by the 1950s, mechanisation, perhaps plus pesticides and herbicides and artificial fertilisers, is reducing the demand for men on the land. The tractor is part of that process, but only part of it.
Everybody knew that we were going through a period of great change on the farms, and I'm talking about the 1950s now, where everybody knew the horse had finished and we were going on into a mechanised age, and everybody welcomed it. The men on the farm were very pleased because it was a lot easier to drive a tractor than it was walk behind a horse, and everybody was pleased. I don't think any of us realised, nobody realised how far it was going to go and how fast we were going to completely alter the whole social fabric of the villages. And at first people welcomed machines, but then after a little while people began to realise, the ones who intended to stay on the farm, they began to realise it was actually going to take away their jobs.
What was happening on the farms and the way technology has changed the face of the countryside began to seep through into public debate.
Does the team agree that local authorities should take a more serious interest in the destruction of hedgerows in this country so that wildlife can be saved?
The tractor didn't have a great effect on the look of the farms until the 50s, and then farmers discovered that their little tiny fields weren't convenient, so they started to put 2 or 3 fields into one, encouraged by government, paid grants to take out hedges and fill in ditches. And we then got, of course, to the stage where very, very large fields, and the general public began to object to the spoiling of the countryside.
Here in East Suffolk, it was obviously the building of the American airfields, or they were called RAF, but they were actually built for the American Air Force. And farmers saw whole villages, or half a village, being levelled in a matter of weeks by bulldozers and things that came in from the United States that were brought in on Lend-Lease. And they looked at this and thought, well, that's marvellous, you've got a great big field there, we could do the same, you know. And certainly at the end of the war, the Caterpillar tractors were coming on the market that had been used to do this work. They were left here, and people started to buy them, and they thought, well, I've got 2 4-acre fields there, and they've always been a darn nuisance, we'll knock the hedge out there. And they knocked one hedge out, and they thought, well, got a 7-acre field, well, we could put that in with another, and it went on at great speed. And as the machines got bigger, you need bigger areas to use them.
It's a very different setup now in 2001, when many of the hedges have been grubbed up, the ditches have been filled in, and the 7-acre fields, which were very common in the 40s, have now become 21 or even 42-acre fields.
Big fields, yes, they're a big advantage to the machinery and the tractor of today, but they all had problems with wet land. I mean, they don't know why at every pond. A tractor didn't want to go to a pond to drink water, but when we had the old horses, I was glad of a drink at a pond. But this all had to be turned over and turned into a new way of farming.
In my own home village of Lavenham, the remembered images of childhood have gone. The only horses you see are from the nearest riding school. There's an antique shop where once there was a blacksmith. The saddlers, the wheelwrights, the hay stores, they're not there anymore. The once dilapidated farm workers' cottages are stylishly restored and conserved. The ostlers and the dear old horsemen are no more than a memory. The farms haven't 30, but 2 or 3 workers. But gone too is the subservience, the hunger, and the grinding poverty. And no one, as Alan Howkins rightly says, is the least bit sorry about that.
The coming of the tractor perhaps undermined some of the old hierarchies of the farm, perhaps did away with what many non-country people would regard as romantic aspects of rural life. But I think if you ask many a farm worker, or particularly many farm worker in the 40s and 50s, he might have looked at it slightly differently.
There are really so very few people actually working on the land.
Well, we said they weren't going to be many men on the farm in years to come. We could see that.
I think I was 17, and I then had the chance of driving a tractor. And I thought that was heaven, to think what I'd got and where I'd got to. And then I never looked back.
Iron Horses was written and presented by Ivan Howlett and produced by Nick Patrick. It was a peer production for BBC Radio 4.